I knew the night was going to be bad the second the elevator jerked to a stop. And even worse when I looked up and realized I wasn't alone. Ryan Blake stood across from me, tall, silent, arms crossed like he owned the 3x5 metal box we were trapped in. And of course it had to be him. The one guy who made every conversation feel like a test I was already failing. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, jabbing the emergency button harder than necessary. But nothing happened. No voice. No reassuring beep. Just the hum of dead air and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead like they were mocking me. I checked my phone. No signal. One pathetic bar teasing me before disappearing completely. Great. Perfect. Amazing. I started pacing, because standing still felt like suffocating. "So we're just stuck? Overnight? In here?" Ryan didn't answer at first, just watched me with that unreadable expression, like he was observing a problem he hadn't decided whether to solve yet. And that somehow made everything worse. "You always talk this much?" he finally said, voice low, calm, like we weren't possibly about to spend the next 8 hours breathing recycled air. "Only when I'm trapped in a metal box with someone who clearly hates me." I shot back before I could stop myself, and there it was, hanging in the space between us. Too honest, too loud. I expected him to roll his eyes, or turn away, or confirm it with silence. But instead he tilted his head slightly, like I'd said something confusing. "I don't hate you," he said. Simple, flat, and somehow that made my chest tighten more than if he had. Could have fooled me. I muttered, turning away, pretending to be very interested in the scuffed elevator wall, because looking at him felt dangerous in a way I didn't have words for. The lights flickered again, dimming, then brightening, then dimming longer this time, and the temperature seemed to drop with it, a subtle chill crawling under my skin. "Okay, that's not good," I said, hugging my arms around myself like that would help. The space suddenly felt smaller, closer, like the walls had inched in when I wasn't looking. I took a step back, and the elevator jolted, sharp and sudden, my balance gone in an instant. "Whoa," I stumbled, feet slipping on the polished floor, and the next thing I knew I was crashing forward, straight into him, solid, warm, hands catching my sides before I could hit the ground. Everything went still, like the world paused just to make this moment last longer than it should. His grip tightened just slightly, steadying, anchoring, and I realized I was gripping his shirt without meaning to, fingers curled into the fabric, like letting go wasn't an option. "You okay?" he asked. Closer now. Too close, his breath brushing the side of my face. And my brain short-circuited somewhere between embarrassment and something else I refused to name. I'm fine," I said quickly, not moving, not pulling away, not doing anything except standing there, caught in his hold. And the worst part was, he didn't let go either. I did not move, and that was the problem, because if I moved, then this would end, and I was not ready to figure out why that felt like a loss. Ryan's hands were still on my sides, steady, firm but not tight, like he was giving me the choice to pull away, and somehow that made it worse, because I was not pulling away. I should have. Obviously, any normal person would have. But my brain was too busy replaying the fact that he had said he did not hate me, and now this very not hating. Behavior that did not match anything I thought I knew about him. "You can let go," I said again, softer this time, less convincing, and he did, but only barely, his hands sliding away slower than necessary, like he was making sure I was stable before letting the space open back up between us. Except the space did not feel the same anymore. It felt charged, like something invisible had shifted and refused to go back. I took a step back, clearing my throat, trying to reset, trying to act like my heart was not doing something deeply embarrassing in my chest. "Thanks," I added, because that was safe, neutral, normal. Ryan just nodded, but his eyes stayed on me a second longer than usual, and I felt it. That look, like it was a physical thing brushing against my skin. "You should sit," he said after a moment, glancing at the floor, less chance of falling again. I almost laughed, because that sounded like him. Practical, controlled, pretending that what just happened was purely about balance and gravity and not whatever else had been in that moment. "Right. Yeah. Falling bad. Got it," I muttered, lowering myself to the floor with my back against the wall, the metal cold through my shirt. He sat across from me at first, a careful distance, like we were two strangers sharing a waiting room, and for a few seconds, Maybe a full minute. There was silence, real silence this time. Not the awkward kind, not the forced kind, just quiet, and I realized I could hear his breathing, steady, slow, grounding in a way that made the space feel less suffocating. The lights flickered again, dimming enough to cast shadows along the walls, and I shivered before I could stop myself. Subtle, but not subtle enough. Because he noticed, of course he did. His gaze dropped, quick, assessing, and then he sighed, like he had made a decision I was not part of. Come here, he said, simple, direct, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. I blinked. What? It is getting colder, he said, already shifting closer, closing the gap I had just created. Body heat is more efficient than pretending you are not freezing. I stared at him, because that was a sentence I was not prepared for, and also because he was now very much not across from me anymore. He was right there, close enough that I could see the faint crease between his brows, close enough that I could count the seconds between his breaths. I am not freezing, I said automatically, even as another shiver betrayed me immediately. He raised an eyebrow, not impressed. You are shaking. I am not, I insisted, and then he reached out, fingers brushing my wrist, light, testing, and everything in me went very still. You are, he said quietly, and before I could argue again, he pulled me closer, not rough, not forceful, just certain, until my shoulder was against his, then my side. Then I realized I was leaning into him without remembering making that choice. My breath caught, just slightly, and he adjusted his arm around me, careful, deliberate, like he was building something he did not want to break. Better, he murmured, and I should have said no. I should have moved. I should have reminded both of us that this was temporary, situational, nothing, but instead I stayed, because it did feel better, warmer, steadier, and because somewhere between the flickering lights and the quiet and his arm around me, I realized the most dangerous thing of all. I did not want him to let go. There was a moment where neither of us spoke, and it stretched just long enough to feel intentional, like we were both aware that something had shifted and neither of us wanted to be the first to break it. I focused on my breathing, on the steady rise and fall of his chest beside me, on the warmth that had replaced the cold in my bones, and for a second I almost forgot we were stuck, almost forgot everything except the fact that his arm was still around me, and he had not moved it, not even an inch. You do this a lot? He asked suddenly, voice low, close enough that I felt it more than heard it. Do what? I replied, even though I had a feeling I knew exactly what he meant. Assume things about people and then decide they are true, he said, calm, not accusing, but not letting me off the hook either. I let out a quiet breath, because of course he was going to go there. Of course he was not just going to let this be simple. You do not exactly make it easy, I said, staring straight ahead, because looking at him felt like stepping into something deeper than I was ready for. You barely talk to me. You look at me like I am. I do not know, inconvenient. There was a pause, and I felt him shift slightly, not pulling away, just adjusting, like he was thinking. That is not what that is, he said after a moment, and something in his tone made my chest tighten again. Then what is it? I asked, before I could stop myself, because apparently tonight was just a series of bad decisions layered on top of worse ones. Another pause, longer this time, and I almost thought he was not going to answer, but then his hand moved, just slightly, fingers brushing against my arm in a way that felt deliberate, grounding. I was trying not to make it obvious, he said quietly, and my brain stalled completely. Not make what obvious? I asked, even though my voice came out softer than I intended, like I was already bracing for something I did not fully understand. He exhaled slowly, and I could feel it, warm against the side of my face. That I notice you, he said, simple, direct, and somehow that hit harder than anything else he could have said, because it was not dramatic, it was not exaggerated, it was just true, and I did not know what to do with that. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at him, really look this time, and he was already looking back, eyes steady, no hesitation, no sign that he regretted saying it, and that was worse, because it meant he meant it. You notice me, I repeated, because my brain needed the extra second to catch up. He nodded once, like it was obvious, like it had always been obvious, more than I should. He added, and something about that phrasing made my stomach flip in a way I was absolutely not prepared for. I swallowed. trying to find something to say that did not sound like I was spiraling internally. That does not make any sense, I said, because that was the safest option: logic, distance, denial. He let out a small breath that might have been a laugh, quiet and brief. It does, he said, and then his hand tightened slightly around my arm. Not enough to trap me, just enough to remind me he was there. You just never gave me the chance to prove it. And that did it. That broke whatever thin layer of control I had left, because suddenly all the moments I had dismissed, all the looks I thought meant irritation, all the silence I assumed was indifference, they started to feel different, like I had been reading everything wrong this entire time, and I did not know if that was better or worse. Ryan. I started, not even sure what I was going to say, but he moved before I could finish, shifting closer, closing what little distance was left between us until I could feel the warmth of him everywhere, steady, real, impossible to ignore. Do not pull away now, he said softly, and it was not a command, not really, but it felt like one anyway, because I realized I had leaned back just slightly, instinctively, like my body was trying to protect me from something my mind had not caught up to yet. And the worst part was, I did not want to pull away. I just did not know what staying meant anymore. My instinct was to move, to create space, to put distance back where it belonged. But his hand shifted slightly against my arm, not tightening, not forcing, just there, warm and steady, like a quiet reminder that I was not alone in this moment. And somehow that was enough to keep me still. I am not pulling away, I said, even though the words came out softer than I intended, like I was trying to convince myself as much as him. Ryan's gaze did not waver, not even for a second, and there was something unnervingly calm about that, like he had already decided something I had not caught up to yet. You were about to, he replied, not accusing, just stating a fact, and I hated that he was right. I hated that he could read me that easily. Maybe I just needed a second. I muttered, shifting slightly, but not away, just enough to breathe without feeling like my thoughts were crowding me from the inside. The elevator hummed faintly around us, the lights flickering again, casting shadows that moved across his face in uneven patterns, and for the first time I noticed the details I had never let myself focus on before. The way his expression softened when he was not actively guarding it. The way his shoulders relaxed just slightly when he was close to me. Like this was not uncomfortable for him. Like this was something he had chosen. You always overthink like this, he said after a moment. And I let out a quiet laugh that held no real humor. Only when things stopped making sense. I admitted, because that was the truth. Nothing about this made sense, not the way he was acting, not the way I was reacting, not the fact that I was still here, leaning into him like it was the most natural thing in the world. Then stop trying to make it make sense, he said, simple, direct, and frustratingly easy. Like that was even an option. I shook my head slightly. That is not how this works, I said. You do not just go from barely speaking to this. I gestured vaguely between us, because I did not have a better word for it. And maybe that was the problem. He followed the motion with his eyes, then looked back at me, something unreadable flickering there for just a second before settling into something steadier. I did not go from nothing to this, he said quietly. You just were not paying attention. That landed harder than I expected, because there was no edge to it, no blame, just honesty, and that made it impossible to dismiss. I opened my mouth to argue, to say something defensive, something that would restore the balance I was used to, but nothing came out, because a part of me knew he was right. A part of me remembered moments I had brushed off, small things that did not fit the narrative I had built in my head, and now they were lining up in a way I could not ignore. You could have said something, I said instead, because that felt safer than admitting I might have been wrong. He shook his head slightly. And risk you pulling away before I even had a chance, he replied. And there it was again, that quiet certainty, like he had been thinking about this longer than I had, like he had been waiting, and the idea of that did something strange to my chest, something warm and unsettling at the same time. The elevator creaked faintly, a distant sound that reminded me we were still stuck, still suspended between floors, between where we were and wherever we were supposed to go next. And somehow that felt fitting, like this moment existed outside of everything else, like it was separate from the world waiting on the other side of those doors. What happens when it opens? I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out softer than I intended. because suddenly that mattered more than it should have. Ryan did not answer right away, his gaze shifting briefly to the closed doors, then back to me. And for a second, I thought he might say something casual, something that would bring us back to normal. But instead, he moved his arm slightly, pulling me just a fraction closer, enough to make my breath catch again. That depends, he said quietly. Are you going to walk away the second you can? And I realized I did not have an answer, not a real one, because the truth was, I did not know if I could. The question hung there longer than it should have, pressing into the space between us like it had weight, and I hated how quickly my mind tried to reach for the safest answer, the easiest one, the version of me that would laugh this off and step out the second those doors opened. I do not know, I admitted instead, because anything else would have been a lie, and something about the way he was looking at me made lying feel impossible. Ryan studied me for a second, not like he was judging, just taking it in, like my answer mattered more than I expected it to. At least that is honest, he said quietly, and the approval in his voice did something small and dangerous in my chest. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my shoulders relaxing just slightly, like I had passed some test I did not know I was taking. You always this intense, I muttered, trying to lighten the moment before it pulled me any deeper. He huffed a quiet breath that might have been amusement. Only when something matters, he replied, and that word, matters, echoed a little too loudly in my head, because I did not know what to do with the idea that this, whatever this was, mattered to him. The elevator creaked again, a faint vibration running through the floor, and instinctively I tensed, my body reacting before my brain could catch up. His arm shifted immediately, hand pressing lightly against my side, grounding, steady, like he had already learned the pattern of my reactions. It is fine, he said, calm, certain, and I realized I believed him, not because of the situation, but because of the way he said it, like he would not let anything actually go wrong, which was ridiculous, because we were literally stuck between floors. But still, I leaned into him just a little more without thinking, and he did not comment on it, did not make it a thing, just adjusted slightly, so I was more comfortable. Like this was normal, like we had done this 100 times before. You are too calm about all of this, I said after a moment, because I needed something to hold on to, something familiar. We could be here for hours. We are already here, he replied simply. Panicking does not change that. I made a face, even though he probably could not see it clearly in the dim light. You are saying that like it is easy. It is not, he said, and there was something in his tone that made me glance up at him again. It is just better than the alternative. I frowned slightly, because that sounded like experience, like something he had learned the hard way, and for a second I wondered what that meant, what kind of situations he had been in that made this feel manageable. But before I could ask, his hand moved again, this time more deliberate, fingers brushing along my arm in a slow, absent motion that felt less like reassurance and more like awareness, like he was reminding himself I was there as much as he was reminding me. My breath caught, just slightly, and I hated how noticeable it felt in the quiet. Still cold, he asked, voice lower now, closer, and I shook my head, even though I was not entirely sure if that was true anymore. No, I said, softer than before. Not really. And that was the problem. It was not just the temperature that had changed, it was everything else, the space, the air, the way my thoughts kept circling back to him no matter how hard I tried to redirect them. Good, he murmured, and for a second neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke, and the silence settled again. But this time it felt different, heavier in a way that was not uncomfortable, just full, like there was more being said in what we were not saying than anything we could put into words. I shifted slightly, testing the distance, and his arm tightened just enough to notice, not stopping me, just acknowledging it, like he was aware of every small movement I made. And that awareness sent a quiet ripple through me I did not know how to process. Ryan. I started again, because apparently I could not stop myself tonight. He hummed softly in response, not pulling away, not looking anywhere else, just there, present. If I do walk away, I said slowly, choosing the words as carefully as I could, what happens then? And this time, he did not hesitate at all, his hand stilled against my arm, his gaze steady. Then I let you, he said, calm, unwavering, and something in my chest dropped, just slightly, before he added, softer, but I do not think you will. And the way he said it made it sound less like a guess, and more like he already knew the answer. His confidence should have annoyed me. It probably would have on any other day, in any other situation, but here, with the dim lights and the quiet hum and the steady warmth of him beside me, it did not feel like arrogance, it felt like certainty, and that was somehow worse, because it made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. "You sound very sure," I said, trying to keep my tone light, but it came out quieter than I intended, like I was testing the words before fully committing to them. Ryan did not look away, not even for a second. "I am," he replied, simple, unshaken, and that should not have made my chest tighten, but it did. I shifted slightly, just enough to create the illusion of space, but his arm adjusted with me, not restricting, just following, like he had no intention of letting the distance grow again, and the fact that he did it so naturally, without hesitation, made it impossible to pretend it was accidental. "You do not even know what I am thinking," I said, because that felt like a safe argument, something logical, something I could use to ground myself again. He exhaled slowly, the sound soft in the quiet. "I do not need to," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made my pulse stutter. "You are still here," he added, and that was it. That was the answer. So simple it almost felt unfair, because he was right. I was still here. I had not moved, had not pushed him away, had not done anything I would have done. If this really meant nothing to me, and realizing that made something inside me shift in a way I could not ignore anymore. I let out a small breath, my head tilting back slightly against the wall as I stared up at the flickering ceiling. "That does not mean anything," I said, but even to my own ears, it sounded weak, like I did not believe it as much as I wanted to. Ryan's hand moved again, this time more deliberate, sliding just slightly along my arm until his fingers rested against my wrist, light, but grounding, like he was measuring something there. "It does," he said quietly. "You just do not like what it means," and that hit too close, too direct, because he was not wrong. I did not like it. I did not like how easily he was breaking through the version of reality I had been comfortable with. I did not like how my body kept leaning toward him like it had made a decision without consulting me. "You are making a lot of assumptions," I said, because arguing felt safer than admitting anything. He hummed softly, not offended, not defensive, just patient. "Then prove me wrong," he replied, and the words settled between us like a challenge I was not prepared for, because I could have pulled away right then, could have stood up, could have put as much space between us as the small elevator allowed. But I did not move, not even a little, and we both noticed. The silence that followed was heavier, more aware, like it was acknowledging something neither of us had said out loud yet. I swallowed, my gaze dropping to where his hand rested against my wrist, the contrast of his skin against mine suddenly impossible to ignore. "This is just because we are stuck," I said after a moment, grasping for something. Anything that made this feel temporary, manageable. His thumb shifted slightly, a small movement that sent a quiet ripple up my arm. And I hated how much I felt it. "If that were true," he said, voice lower now, closer, "you would be counting the minutes until you could get away from me." I did not respond, because I could not, because the truth was I had not thought about the time in a while. Not really. Not since everything had shifted into something I did not have a name for. And that silence gave him all the answer he needed. His grip did not tighten, did not trap, but it stayed, steady and certain, like he was giving me all the space in the world to leave, while knowing I would not take it. And that realization settled deep in my chest, heavier than anything else that had happened tonight, because for the first time, I started to wonder if he was right, not just about this moment, but about me. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, like every second was carrying something unspoken between us. And I could not tell if that made it better or worse, because the more I sat there, the more I became aware of everything. The steady warmth of his arm around me, the subtle movement of his thumb resting near my wrist, the way my body had completely stopped resisting the closeness like it had quietly given up the fight without telling me. "Say something," I muttered under my breath, more to myself than to him, because my thoughts were getting too loud, too tangled. Ryan glanced at me, one eyebrow lifting slightly. "About what?" he asked, calm as ever, and I let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Anything," I said, because if he kept looking at me like that without saying anything, I was going to overthink this into something I could not recover from. He considered that for a second, his gaze shifting briefly before settling back on me. You always feel silence like it is something to fix, he said, and I frowned slightly, because that was not what I expected. It is something to fix, I replied. Silence means something is wrong. He shook his head just slightly. Not always, he said. Sometimes it just means you are not running. And that word again, running, hit a little too close, because I knew exactly what he meant. I had spent a long time avoiding things that felt too complicated, too uncertain, and now here I was, stuck in a situation where avoiding was not an option, and somehow that had forced everything to the surface. I shifted slightly, my shoulder pressing more firmly against his without thinking, and he adjusted immediately, like he had been waiting for it, like every small movement I made was something he noticed. You are doing that thing again, he said quietly. What thing? I asked, even though I had a feeling I knew. Thinking too far ahead, he replied, and I huffed softly, because he was not wrong. That is kind of my thing, I said, planning for the worst, expecting things to go back to normal. And what if they do not? He asked, and there it was, the question I had been avoiding without even realizing it, because normal did not feel like an option anymore. Not after this, not after everything that had shifted in the span of what felt like minutes, but had somehow changed the way I looked at him entirely. I swallowed, my gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. Then I guess I would have to figure out what that means, I said slowly, and he watched me carefully, like he was measuring every word, every hesitation. You could start by not pretending this is nothing, he said, and his voice was softer now, not pushing, just steady, and I felt something in my chest tighten again, because he was right. Again, I had been trying to label this as temporary, situational, something that would disappear the moment the elevator doors opened, but the longer I sat here, the less that felt true. It is not nothing, I admitted, the words quieter than I expected, like saying them out loud, made them more real than I was ready for. His expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to notice, like something had settled into place. Good, he said, and that single word carried more weight than it should have. I let out a slow breath, my head tilting just slightly until it brushed against his shoulder. A small, almost unconscious movement that I only realized after it happened, and for a second I froze, waiting for him to react, to pull away, to say something, but he did not. He just stayed there, steady like it was the most natural thing in the world, like this was exactly where I was supposed to be, and that realization was both terrifying and strangely calming at the same time. You are not making this easy, I murmured, because that felt like the only safe thing to say. He let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I am not trying to, he replied, and something about that honesty made it impossible to look away, because for the first time, I realized he was not just reacting to the situation, he was choosing this, choosing to be here, choosing to hold on to this moment instead of letting it pass. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was doing the same thing, even if I had not admitted it until now. Time moved strangely after that, not in minutes or seconds but in breaths and small shifts, in the way his thumb traced absent patterns against my wrist, and the way I stopped noticing the cold entirely, like the world outside this space had faded into something distant and irrelevant. I was aware of it, of course, the situation, the fact that we were still stuck, that eventually someone would fix the elevator, and this would end. But it no longer felt immediate, it no longer felt urgent, and that should have worried me more than it did. You are getting quieter, Ryan said after a while, his voice breaking the silence just enough to pull me back, but not enough to ruin whatever this was. I exhaled softly, my head still resting lightly against his shoulder. I think I ran out of things to panic about, I admitted, and he let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like approval. Good, he said, simple as always, and I tilted my head slightly, just enough to glance at him from the corner of my eye. You really do not panic, do you? I added, because I needed to understand how he could stay this calm, this steady, when everything about this situation should have been unsettling. He was quiet for a moment, and I felt the shift before I saw it, something subtle in the way his posture changed, like he was choosing his words more carefully this time. I used to, he said finally, and that caught my attention more than anything else he had said tonight, because it was the first time he had offered something personal without being pushed. I straightened slightly, not pulling away, just enough to look at him properly. "What changed?" I asked, and he held my gaze for a second before answering, like he was deciding how much to give me. "I realized it does not help," he said, and that sounded too simple, too controlled, like there was more behind it than he was saying. "That sounds like a very incomplete answer," I said, and for a second I thought he might deflect, might shut it down, but instead his hand shifted again, fingers curling slightly against my arm in a way that felt grounding, like he was anchoring himself as much as me. "It is enough for now," he replied, and I nodded slowly, because I understood the need to keep certain things contained, especially when everything else felt like it was shifting too quickly. The elevator creaked faintly again, a low mechanical sound that echoed through the small space. And this time I did not tense, did not panic. I just noticed it, and then let it go. And that alone felt like a change, like something inside me had settled without me realizing it. "See," he said quietly, and I glanced at him, confused for a second. "You are not panicking anymore," he added, and I blinked, because he was right. I was not even a little, and that realization hit me in a way I was not expecting, because it meant that somewhere between the moment the elevator stopped and now, something had shifted in me, something I had not consciously decided. "Maybe I am just distracted," I said lightly, even though the word felt like an understatement. He hummed softly, not disagreeing, and for a moment neither of us spoke again, the silence settling in a way that felt almost comfortable now, like we had adjusted to it, like we had found a rhythm within it. I shifted slightly, testing the space again, and this time his arm moved with me immediately, pulling me just a fraction closer without hesitation, like the distance I had tried to create did not even exist to him anymore. My breath caught, subtle but noticeable, and I felt his attention sharpen instantly. "Still thinking about leaving?" he asked, and I shook my head before I could overthink it. "No," I said, and that answer came too easily, too honestly, and we both felt it, the weight of it settling into the moment. His grip did not tighten, did not trap, but it stayed firm, certain, like he was acknowledging the answer without needing anything more. "Good," he murmured again, and I let out a quiet breath, my fingers curling slightly against my own sleeve as I tried to process how easily that word affected me now, how something so simple could feel so significant. And as the quiet stretched around us again, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a completely different way. I was no longer waiting for the elevator to open. I was not counting the time, not hoping for the moment this would end. Instead, I found myself wondering how long we still had like this, how much longer I could stay here before the outside world came rushing back in and forced everything to make sense again. And for the first time that night, that thought did not bring relief. It brought something dangerously close to disappointment. The thought lingered longer than I expected, settling somewhere deep and quiet. The realization that I was not waiting for this to end, that I was not counting down to freedom, but instead measuring time by how long I could stay right here. And that should have been alarming. It should have sent me spiraling back into logic and distance and all the things I used to protect myself. But it did not. Instead it just stayed, steady and undeniable. "You are thinking again," Ryan said softly, and I blinked, pulled back just slightly by the sound of his voice. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, and he hummed in quiet agreement. "Your breathing changes," he said, like it was the simplest thing in the world to notice, and I frowned a little, because that level of attention felt unfair, like he had been paying closer attention to me than I ever realized. "That is a weird thing to notice," I muttered, and he shifted slightly beside me, his arm adjusting, so I settled more comfortably against him. Like the conversation did not interrupt the physical ease between us at all. "Not really," he replied. "Not when it is you." And there it was again, those small, simple statements that carried too much weight. I swallowed, my gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. "You say things like that like they are normal," I said, quieter now, and he let out a soft breath that almost felt like it brushed across my thoughts. "They are normal," he said. "You just are not used to hearing them." I did not have an answer for that, because he was right, again, and that pattern was starting to feel less like coincidence and more like something I needed to pay attention to. The elevator let out a faint mechanical sound, a low vibration that ran through the floor and into my bones, and for a split second, I thought this was it, that the doors would open, that the moment would break, that everything would snap back into something recognizable. My body tensed instinctively, not out of fear this time, but out of something else, something sharper, something closer to reluctance. And Ryan noticed immediately. Of course he did, his hand pressing lightly against my arm. Grounding, steady. It is just the system resetting, he said calmly, and I nodded. Even though my focus had shifted entirely to something else, the idea that this could end any second, that whatever this was between us would be forced to exist outside of this small, contained space. And I did not know what that would look like. I did not know if it would hold or if it would disappear the second reality came back in. You felt that, he added quietly, and I glanced at him, confused for a moment. Felt what? I asked. Even though I had a feeling I knew, his gaze held mine, steady, searching. You do not want this to end, he said. Not a question, just a statement, and my breath caught, just slightly, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way I could not ignore anymore. I opened my mouth to argue, to deny it, to fall back into something safer, but the words did not come, because there was nothing to hide behind anymore. The truth was already there, sitting between us, impossible to ignore. I started, but stopped, because I did not know how to finish that sentence without changing everything. Ryan did not push, did not rush me. He just waited, his hand still, his presence steady, like he was giving me the space to reach the conclusion on my own. And that somehow made it harder, not easier. I let out a slow breath, my gaze dropping briefly before lifting again. I do not know what happens after this, I admitted, and that felt like the closest thing to honesty I could manage without completely unraveling. He nodded slightly, like he expected that answer, like it made sense to him. Neither do I, he said, and there was something in that, something grounding, something that made this feel less like a problem to solve and more like something to figure out together. But I know this is not something I am letting go of like it did not happen, he added, and my chest tightened again, because that meant he was carrying this forward, beyond this space, beyond this moment. And suddenly the idea of the doors opening did not feel like an escape anymore. It felt like a turning point I was not sure I was ready for, but also not sure I wanted to avoid. And as the quiet settled around us again, heavier now, more aware, I realized something else. Something even more unsettling. I was not just staying because I could not leave, I was staying because I was choosing to. That realization settled deeper than anything else that night. Heavier than the silence, heavier than his words, because it stripped away every excuse I had been holding on to. I was not stuck here anymore. Not really. Not in the way that mattered. I was choosing this, choosing to stay close, choosing not to pull away. And once I saw that, I could not unsee it. Say it, Ryan said quietly, and I blinked, pulled back just slightly by the shift in his tone. Say what? I asked, even though my voice came out softer, like I already knew where this was going. He did not move, did not change the way he was holding me, just watched me with that same steady focus that had been unraveling me piece by piece all night. That you are not here because you have to be, he said, and the words landed exactly where he intended them to, leaving no room to dodge, no room to deflect. I swallowed, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, because avoiding it was not an option anymore, not when he was looking at me like that, not when I had already crossed the line in my own head. I am not here because I have to be, I said slowly, the words feeling heavier as they left my mouth, like they carried more meaning than I was ready to fully process. And the moment I said it, something shifted, subtle but undeniable, like the air itself had changed. Ryan exhaled softly, a quiet release of something I had not realized he was holding, and his hand moved slightly against my arm, not tightening, just settling, like the answer had confirmed something he already knew. Good, he murmured again, and this time the word felt different, deeper, like it was marking something, not just acknowledging it. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, my head tilting slightly as I tried to steady my thoughts. But it was harder now, because everything felt clearer and more complicated at the same time. You planned this, I said suddenly, the thought slipping out before I could filter it, and he raised an eyebrow slightly, not surprised, just curious. Planned what? He asked, calm as ever, and I shook my head a little, trying to piece it together. Not this, I clarified quickly, but this? I gestured vaguely between us. Again, because words were still failing me when it came to whatever this was. "You have been waiting for something like this to happen," I said, and he watched me for a second, considering, before answering. "I was waiting for you to stop running long enough for me to say something," he replied, and that hit just as hard as everything else he had said tonight, because it meant this had not started here, not in this elevator, not in this moment. It had been building quietly, unnoticed, until now. "You could have said something before," I said. Even though I already knew the answer, he shook his head slightly. "You would not have listened," he said simply, and I could not argue with that, because he was right. I would have brushed it off, would have explained it away, would have kept everything safely distant. But here, in this space where there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide, I had been forced to actually see it, to actually feel it, and that made all the difference. The elevator hummed again, louder this time, a deeper vibration that ran through the walls, and instinctively I tensed, not out of fear, but because this felt different, more final, like something was about to change. Ryan noticed immediately, his hand shifting slightly against my arm, grounding me again without needing to say anything. "They are probably fixing it," I said quietly, more to myself than to him, and he nodded once, his gaze flicking briefly to the doors before returning to me. "Probably," he agreed, and for a second neither of us spoke. The reality of that settling in, the idea that this moment was about to end, that the space we had been existing in, separate from everything else, was about to open up and let the world back in. "Ryan," I started, because suddenly there were too many things I needed to say and not enough time to say them. But he cut me off gently, not with words, but with a slight shift, his arm tightening just enough to keep me close, not trapping, just holding, like he was not ready to let the moment slip away either. "We are not done," he said quietly, and something about the certainty in his voice made my breath catch again, because it was not a question, not a hope. It was a promise, and for the first time, I realized I was not afraid of what happened next. I was just not ready for this to end. The hum grew louder, no longer a distant vibration, but something real, something immediate, and it changed the air in the small space instantly, like a quiet countdown had started without warning. I felt it in the way my chest tightened, not from fear, not from panic, but from something sharper, something that felt like time slipping through my fingers faster than I could hold on to it. "It is happening," I said under my breath, not really thinking about the words, just letting them out as the realization settled in. Ryan did not respond right away, but his arm shifted again, subtle, deliberate, pulling me just a fraction closer, like he was anchoring the moment before it disappeared completely. The elevator jolted lightly, not enough to throw us off balance, just enough to confirm it. This was it, the end of whatever strange, suspended world we had been in. "Hey," his voice came low and steady, cutting through the noise of my thoughts before they could spiral, and I turned my head, slightly, meeting his gaze, and there was something there I had not seen before. Not hesitation, not doubt, just a quiet intensity that made everything else fade out for a second. "Look at me," he said, and I did, because somehow that felt easier than thinking about what came next. The flickering light cast uneven shadows across his face, but his expression was clear, focused, like he had already decided something and was just waiting for me to catch up. "Do not disappear when those doors open," he said, and the words landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight, because they were not about this moment. They were about what came after, about the part one had been avoiding, even as I admitted I did not want this to end. I swallowed, my breath catching just slightly, because there was no easy answer to that, not one that would keep everything simple and untouched. "I am not going to disappear," I said, and it felt like the truth, even if I did not fully understand what it meant yet. His gaze held mine for a second longer, like he was measuring the weight of my words, and then he nodded once, small but certain, like that was enough, like he believed me, and that somehow made it feel more real than if he had questioned it. The elevator shifted again, a low mechanical sound echoing through the walls, and this time there was a faint click, followed by the soft whir of something unlocking. I felt my body tense instinctively, not because I wanted to pull away, but because I knew I should, because this moment was about to end whether I was ready or not. But Ryan did not move, did not loosen his hold. If anything, his arm tightened, just slightly, not trapping, just holding, like he was making sure I stayed grounded through the transition. You were thinking about it again, he murmured, and I let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh. I am thinking about a lot of things, I admitted, because that was the only honest answer left. He shifted slightly, just enough that I could feel the change in his posture, the subtle way he turned toward me more fully, even as the space around us started to come back to life. Then focus on one, he said, and I frowned slightly, because that sounded impossible. Which one? I asked, and his gaze did not waver, not even as the faint outline of light began to appear between the elevator doors. The one where you do not walk away, he said, and my chest tightened again, because that was not just a suggestion, it was a choice, one I had already started making without fully realizing it. The doors let out a soft mechanical sound, beginning to part just slightly, letting in a thin strip of bright hallway light that cut through the dim interior. And for a second, everything felt suspended again, not because we were stuck, but because this was the moment where everything shifted from something contained to something real, and I realized I was not afraid of it anymore. Not the way I had been at the start of the night. I was just aware of it, aware of what it meant, of what it could become. Ryan, I said quietly, and he hummed in response, still not letting go, still holding on to the moment like it had not ended yet. I am not going anywhere, I added, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just something steady and certain settling into place. And as the doors opened a little wider, letting the outside world back in, I realized that this was not the end of something. It was the beginning of something I had not expected but was no longer trying to avoid. The doors slid open wider with a soft mechanical sound, letting in bright hallway light that felt almost too sharp after hours in the dim, flickering space. And for a second I just stared at it, like my body needed time to remember what normal looked like, what it felt like to not be suspended between moments. Voices echoed faintly from outside, distant, unaware, like the world had kept moving without us, and yet I did not move. I did not step forward, because Ryan's arm was still around me, steady and certain, and leaving that felt harder than it should have. They are here, I said quietly, more to fill the space than anything else, but he did not respond, not right away. Instead his hand shifted slightly against my arm, a small, deliberate movement that made me glance at him instead of the open doors, and his gaze was still on me, not on the hallway, not on the people who would probably show up any second, just on me, like this was the only thing that mattered in that moment. You said you were not going anywhere, he said, and it was not a question, not really, just a reminder, and I nodded, because that part had not changed, not even with the doors open, not even with the world rushing back in. I meant it, I replied, and my voice was steadier than I expected, like the decision had already settled somewhere deeper than doubt. He studied me for a second longer, like he was confirming it, like he needed to see it in more than just words. And then he nodded once, small but certain, and something in my chest eased in a way I had not realized was tight. The hallway noise grew slightly louder, footsteps approaching, the distant sound of someone calling out to check if anyone was inside, and reality pressed closer. But Ryan did not pull away, not yet, his arm still around me, his presence still grounding in a way that made everything else feel less overwhelming. We should probably move, I said, even though I did not make any effort to actually do it. And he let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like agreement, but his hand remained where it was. In a second, he replied, and something about that made my chest tighten again, not in a bad way, just in a way that felt significant. Like he was holding on to the last moment before everything shifted, and I realized I was doing the same thing. Neither of us quite ready to step out of this and into whatever came next. The voices outside grew clearer, closer, someone knocking lightly against the metal frame, asking if we were okay, and I felt the urgency of the situation press in again, the expectation that we would respond, that we would step out and return to normal. But normal did not feel the same anymore, not after this. Not after everything that had changed in ways I could not fully explain. Ryan, I said softly, and he hummed in response, still not moving, still holding on to the moment like it had not already started to slip away. If we step out there, I continued, my words slower now, more deliberate, things are going to be different. And he did not hesitate, did not question it, just nodded once, like that was obvious, like it had always been obvious. Yeah, he said simply. And then his hand shifted, not letting go, but adjusting. His fingers brushing lightly against my wrist in that same grounding way that had become familiar over the past hours. "They already are," he added, and that was it. That was the truth I had been circling around all this time. This was not something that would disappear when the doors opened. It had already changed something, already set something in motion that could not be undone. I let out a slow breath, my gaze flicking briefly to the open hallway before returning to him. And for the first time, the idea of stepping out did not feel like losing something. It felt like carrying it forward, like whatever this was would not stay trapped in that elevator. It would follow us out, into whatever came next. "Okay," I said quietly. And this time I meant something more than just agreement. I meant that I was ready, or at least ready enough to take the next step, even if I did not know exactly what it would look like. Ryan watched me for a second longer, like he was making sure I was certain, and then, finally, his arm loosened just slightly, not completely, just enough to give me the space to move if I chose to. But he did not step away, did not create distance, just shifted with me. Like whatever this was did not end here. It just changed shape. And as the voices outside grew louder and the moment stretched into something new, I realized that stepping out of the elevator did not feel like leaving him behind. It felt like stepping into something we were both already a part of. We stepped out together, not at the same time, but not separately either. Like there was an invisible thread still holding the space between us intact. The hallway lights were brighter than I expected, the air cooler, voices clearer now as a maintenance worker approached with a relieved expression, asking if we were okay, if we needed anything, and I nodded automatically, answering questions I barely processed, because my attention was somewhere else entirely, still anchored to the quiet weight of Ryan beside me, still aware of the way he had not fully let go, his hand brushing lightly against my wrist even as we moved, like a subtle reminder that this had not been left behind in that elevator. "You are all set," the worker said, gesturing toward the open hallway, and I nodded again, murmuring something polite, something normal, but normal felt different now, thinner somehow, like it did not quite fit anymore. We started walking, slow at first, side by side, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The noise of the building filling the space where silence had lived before, but it did not feel the same, not empty. Just different, like the quiet we had shared had not disappeared. It had just shifted into something we carried with us. "So," I said finally, the word feeling too small for everything that had happened, but it was all I had. Ryan glanced at me, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly, not quite a smile, just something softer than I had seen before. "So," he echoed, and that almost made me laugh, because of course it did. Of course after everything, after all of that, we were back to something as simple as this. I let out a breath, shaking my head a little. I trailed off, because I did not have the right word, not one that could hold all of it without breaking it apart. He watched me for a second, like he was giving me time to figure it out, but I just shook my head again. "I do not have a word for it," I admitted, and he nodded, like he understood, like he had already accepted that some things did not need to be explained to be real. We slowed near the end of the hallway, where the space opened up into something more familiar, more public, and for the first time since we stepped out, I felt the shift, the awareness of everything around us, the reminder that we were no longer alone, that whatever this was had to exist here now, in the open, not just in the quiet isolation of a broken elevator. I stopped without meaning to, my steps faltering just slightly, and Ryan noticed immediately. Of course he did, his movement stopping with mine, his attention shifting fully back to me like nothing else mattered. "Hey," he said softly, and there was that same steadiness again, the same grounding presence that had carried me through the night. "You are still here," I said, and it came out more like a realization than a question, because part of me had expected this to fade the second we stepped out, to dissolve into something easier to ignore, but it had not. It was still there, just as real, just as present, maybe even more now that it had nowhere to hide. "I told you," he replied, simple, certain, like there had never been any doubt, and something in my chest settled in a way I had not realized was still unsettled. I nodded slowly, my gaze dropping for a second before lifting again, meeting his eyes, and this time I did not look away. "Then what now?" I asked, and the question felt different now, not uncertain, not hesitant, just open. like I was ready to see where this went instead of trying to define it before it even had a chance. Ryan studied me for a second, like he was measuring the shift, like he could see the difference in the way I was standing here compared to hours ago. And then he stepped just a fraction closer, not enough to draw attention, just enough that the space between us felt intentional again, familiar in a way that made my breath steady instead of catch. Now, he said quietly, his voice low but clear, we do not pretend this was nothing. And I felt something settle into place, something quiet and certain, because that was it. That was the answer I had been circling around this entire time. Not a plan, not a label, just a choice. And I nodded, a small, steady movement that carried more meaning than I would have expected. Okay, I said. And this time the word felt complete, like it was enough on its own. And as we stood there, not rushing, not pulling away, I realized something else, something that made everything that had happened feel less like an accident and more like the beginning of something that had been waiting to happen all along. This was not the end of that night. It was just the first moment we chose not to let it fade.